Our second reading comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all of the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It has been already, in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to be among those who come after. May God bless the reading of His word. Amen. Please be seated. Now, before I begin, I wanted to recognize someone, Sandy Stubblefield. This is her first time back, I think, in maybe a year since she's been struggling with her illness, and I just wanted to welcome her back personally and say that it's so good to see you, Sandy. Appreciate you being here. We're going to begin this afternoon with a series of statements, the source or sources of which I'm going to reveal in just a moment, although I may have just tipped my hand in what I read. But see if you can identify the unnamed speaker by what is said. A man is no better off than an animal, because life has no meaning for either. And what about this curious citation? Don't be too good or too wise. Why kill yourself? Don't be too wicked or too foolish either. Why die before you have to? And finally, which toxic male author penned this provocative proverb? I found one man in 1,000 that I could respect, but not one woman. As you probably have already guessed, all of these quotations come from the same source, from the same philosopher, the wisest man who ever lived, in fact, Solomon. These are all witticisms recorded by the king in his book Ecclesiastes. And thus, in one real sense, they are not just Solomon's words, but God's. But how can this be, you might wonder? How could God inspire proverbs whose purchase in the world seem equal to that of a fortune cookie? Well, to answer that question, we have to place this work in its historical and literary context. Unlike the Song of Songs, which was written by Solomon in the passion of youth to confess his infatuation with his beloved, or Proverbs, which he penned in the maturity of middle age to counsel his son, Ecclesiastes comes at the end of the monarch's life, at a time of sober reflection upon his past endeavors, which is a dangerous exercise to engage in, by the way, because to reflect upon one's life at its end means that any bitter disappointments can only be embraced or repressed, for the time to do something about them is long since past. And how wretched an experience it would be to realize that all of one's pursuits in the final analysis are meaningless, which was unfortunately the case for Solomon, and which explains why much of this book is marked by such a wallowing despair, a hopelessness reflected in its thesis statement found in verse 2 of chapter 1. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Solomon was a man who had the power to do anything that he wanted to do, the wealth to indulge every whim, the genius to achieve any goal, the ambition to pursue every course, and so he did, with a dizzying array of success, which is well documented in Scripture. For example, the king mastered the science of agriculture, even breeding his own cattle. He also promoted the fields of art and architecture, commissioning not only majestic palaces and massive magisterial buildings, but most notably Israel's original temple. He fitted the first Hebrew navy with merchant vessels and cultivated lush public gardens. And he curated the foremost works of artistic achievement. He also amassed a vast fortune in commercial trade, gaining an affluence the likes of which had never been seen, which allowed him to perpetually feast upon the physical pleasures of food, wine, and dare we say women, since polygamy was permitted in the Old Covenant, accumulating, we are told, 1,000 wives and concubines. He was arrayed in the glory of the finest linens and jewels, and admired by the chicest celebrities of the day, the sort of who's who of the ancient world, including the Queen of Sheba, who, according to one story, thought to honor the king with 40 mules worth of gold bricks. But when her caravan reached the wide plain leading to Solomon's palace, she noticed that the top layer of the plateau was pure gold. For 40 days, it is said, she journeyed on that gold. All of this to say that nothing was beyond this man's reach. And yet, after a lifetime of such enviable success and prosperity, Solomon looked back upon it all with disdain. Verse 11 of chapter 2 says, "Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." All of Solomon's admirable achievements, everything that he had built, every advantage he had gained, every victory he had won, all of it, in the end, profited him nothing, he says. And that's because upon reflection, the king realized that it was only a matter of time before all of his efforts would be undone in the natural entropy of the universe, as we could call it. As his heirs squandered his fortune, and his kingdom fell into corruption, as his gold rusted, and his garments were eaten by moths. All of the order he had imposed upon the world, all of the potential that he had drawn from it, all of the cultivation that he superintended, would inevitably return to its original state of chaos. Because this is the natural progression, or should we say regression, of things in this fallen world: to decay, to deteriorate, to retreat into an uncultivated state once left unattended. And if this is the end of all of our labor, he thought to himself, if it is to end in nothing, then what is the point of any of it? Why bother tilling the earth by the sweat of your brow, only for it to return to an overgrown state once left unattended at your death? And we can certainly feel the force of his reasoning, because what remains of Solomon's kingdom today? Of all of his awe-inspiring achievement, what remains? What remains of this golden road which took 40 days to traverse? The answer is nothing, not a thing. Other than a few fragmentary relics which took generations of zealous archaeologists to discover, all of Solomon's triumphs have been erased from history. They have been swallowed up by the earth, including Solomon himself. Every so often I find myself, maybe this means there's something wrong with me, but I find myself meandering through Oddfellows Cemetery, which is just 7 or 8 blocks northeast from here. Oddfellows is likely the oldest cemetery in Georgetown, and perhaps it's even the oldest cemetery in Williamson County. And its graves stretch back to at least the 1860s. And buried within it are many of Georgetown's early pioneers and prominent citizens, including Nanny Elizabeth Morrow, who was not only the wife of Captain J.C.S. Morrow, but she was also the eldest daughter of a general who went by the name of Sam Houston. who of course was the first elected president of the Republic of Texas and later served as governor of Texas during the Civil War. By the way, he worked against the idea of seceding from the Union. But Oddfellows is really the resting place of the who's who of our city. The men and women of vision and resolve who established the government and chartered the university and built the schools and planted the churches. It's interesting, St. John's, this church, has its own cemetery. It's very similar to the Oddfellows Cemetery. And it includes some of those who helped to build this very building at the turn of the century. In fact, the man who built my house in the 1870s, I live in Old Town, he's also buried in Oddfellows. He was a Confederate soldier in the Civil War and a member of the cavalry. Although I will say this, it was hard to find his gravestone because his name was almost erased. It had almost disappeared from the limestone monument. Indeed, much of the cemetery, if you go and visit it, you will notice looks like ancient ruins, with many of the grave markers turning to rubble. And so, when you survey the grounds, you can't help but be struck by the fact that the vast majority of the souls buried there have been forgotten, that no one ever visits these graves anymore, and that soon even those memorials will vanish with the ravages of time, meaning that in just 200 years, every trace of their existence will be erased. Not even a memory of them will remain. And that's just in 200 years. Imagine what will be forgotten in 500 years, or in 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, our entire civilization could be wiped from the landscape. Imagine the forest retaking the town of Georgetown. Or imagine Austin being returned to an uncultivated prairie. It's hard to imagine. It seems impossible. But as Solomon says in verse 4 of our text, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Solomon realized that the wilderness begins its return the moment we take our hand from the plow, a time which is coming for us all. But here's the thing, our situation is even worse than this. It's even worse than Solomon could have imagined. Because not only do civilizations face extinction when neglected, but so does our entire universe, science tells us. This is an insight I take from philosopher Bill Craig, who puts it this way. According to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe is expanding, and everything in it is moving farther and farther apart. And as it does so, it grows colder, as all of its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes, which means that there will be no light at all. There will be no heat. There will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space. A universe in ruins. A reversal, you might say, of the creation account of Genesis 1 and 2. A kind of decreation, a return to the original chaos when the earth was formless and void. This is the fate of our universe if left unattended, which means that not only will the life of each individual person be erased as a result of such entropy, but the entire universe will be erased, which makes all of our collective toiling under the sun utterly pointless. Some have compared it to arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It might give you something to do, but the ship is going down regardless, and all will be lost. All of which helps to explain the kind of apathetic wisdom that we find scattered throughout this book. Because if man is no better off than an animal, if both end in the same grave, then why should he kill himself, being overly good or overly wise? For the same fate comes to the righteous and the wicked alike, to the discerning and to the foolish. Therefore, the one who makes sacrifices is no better off than the one who doesn't, nor is the one who keeps his promises than the one who breaks them. For one fate awaits them all. This is the curse of man, says Solomon. Because he ends in nothing, nothing he does matters. For as Solomon says later in this text, the end is what defines the beginning. And so the contributions of the scientist to the advancement of human understanding, the breakthroughs of the researcher to alleviate pain and suffering, the efforts of the diplomat to secure peace between warring nations, the sacrifice of the soldier on the battlefield to thwart totalitarian encroachment, every triumphant act ever performed is ultimately meaningless, for its fate is always the same: to be thoroughly undone in the heat death of the universe. And therefore, all of human achievement is nothing more than sound and fury signifying nothing, as Shakespeare said. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Therefore, Ecclesiastes is much more a book of questions than it's a book of answers. The answers can be found in the rest of Scripture. Solomon's task is to pose the provocative questions which challenge the myths that we comfort ourselves with. In particular, his aim is to confront us with the terrible truth that our world is cursed. It's cursed into futility. And that's a truth that we have suppressed. And the reason why this forceful kind of confrontation is necessary is because the natural confrontation that one might experience is something that many of us will never experience. Because few of us will achieve the level of success that's required, the level of success that Solomon had, which makes the futility of the universe plain. And therefore, we will continue to cling to the false hope that one day we really will accomplish something lasting. We will accomplish an achievement which won't be undone as soon as we enter into the ground. And therefore our legacy will endure. And therefore we will be remembered, creating, as it were, in our mind at least, our own immortality. Or another popular false hope that Solomon alludes to is people think, well, I'm just going to do something unique. Right? I'm going to provide the civilization. I'm going to contribute something unique, something new to the civilization, so that they will have to remember me. Ecclesiastes is designed to bring us to grips with the absurdity of such hopes, forcing us to acknowledge the inescapable consequences of the fall of man and the subsequent curse of God, the curse of futility, about which we can do nothing. However, Solomon doesn't end his reflection in despair, but rather he ends it in hope, providing his young readers a brief glimpse of a future which is far from fruitless, reminding them that, though it may seem to be the case, God has not left this world unattended, that he has not abandoned his creation to futility, but that in the end, he will restore order. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter, when everything has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment and every secret thing, whether good or evil. There is a judgment coming, says Solomon, and this means that our labors are not in vain, that keeping God's commandments, the choosing of righteousness over wickedness, is not arbitrary, but has eternal consequences. For life does not end in death, but in judgment, where the pious will be rewarded and fools condemned. And so he exhorts his readers to remember the Creator in their youth, before they are old and feeble like him, and their labors have ceased. For this, as he says, is the whole duty of man. A duty which is greatly expanded in the New Testament as God reveals his plan for redeeming his creation from its futility. As I said before, Solomon, absent what we've learned, the revelation of science, didn't fully realize how bad our state really is. And in the same sense, absent the revelation of the New Testament, he didn't see how glorious God's resolution of this crisis is either. And we see some of that in Romans chapter 8, the passage we read at the beginning in the first reading, Romans 8:20. Let me read to you 20 through 23. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, that's God, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. God's project of redemption, of recreation, says Paul, has already begun with the pouring out of his Spirit on Pentecost and the redeeming of the people of God, marking the return of the royal priesthood, the first fruits, as Paul says, of the new creation. Laborers who will continue the Spirit's liberating work of rescuing all of creation from its futility, reversing the curse, you could say, returning our planet to its former glory as a dwelling place of God and man. This is viewing the earth as we find it portrayed in the opening chapters of Genesis as God's temple, which now lies in ruins, Paul says, but will one day be restored to its former glory, a building with eternal foundations and Christ as its cornerstone. And we who have been liberated are to join in that building effort, each of us contributing to a section. You might say we are to take up the task of Nehemiah, which is interesting about Nehemiah. I want to come back to the text where he builds the wall. But there are a lot of ancient Jewish commentators who refer to Nehemiah, perhaps strangely, as a king and a priest, right? That even though he's in the lineage of David, therefore he's a king, that he's also a priest, even though he's of the tribe of Judah, which of course is very messianic, but it speaks to us as well. This is the vocation we are to return to, with a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. Maybe that's the way to think of this, because we're not obviously going to accomplish all the work ourselves. There's a massive amount of regeneration that Christ is going to do when he returns, but maybe the idea is that we're going to build the wall, and then Christ is going to come and build the temple, restore the temple. Thus, far from futile, notice, our labors are now empowered by the Spirit, bearing his fruit, meaning that progress can now be made through the power of the resurrection. In fact, this is exactly what the resurrection of Jesus declares, that the futility of the curse has begun to be undone, and that eventually even death itself will be conquered. Which also means that we have absolute assurance that we will not be abandoned to Sheol, that the grave will not be our final resting place, that we will not be forgotten, that Christ will not forsake us, but raise us to everlasting life. So even though we groan inwardly now, as we await the redemption of this physical world, our efforts to bring order to it are not in vain, even though they may not abide. For they are a signpost directing all to the coming new earth, in whose soil our labor will yield a crop of 100-fold, ensuring us a legacy, which, as Peter says, is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. And so let us not grow weary then, brethren, in doing good, in cultivating this earth, in building this temple, for we do not labor in vain.